Okay, everyone, hello.
Hello.
All right, welcome to the Great Cities Institute and to our forum on Latino environmental justice leadership along industrial waterways. I'm Teresa Cordova, director of the Great Cities Institute here at UIC. Professor Rachel Haverlock is director of the Freshwater Lab. We are so excited and honored that all of you are here. I want to make sure I also introduce Rosa Cabrera, who is the director here at UIC's Latino Cultural Center. Rosa is always happy when you are here, and thank you for all of you for being here. This is an event that is featuring some of the environmental justice leaders from Chicago and Joliet, who will share their experiences, knowledge, and strategies to address environmental injustice or environmental racism along the waterways due to both past and current industrial activities. This program is part of our participation, mine and Professor Haverlock's, in Crossing Latinidades initiative, which includes researchers and students from Research One and Hispanic serving institutions throughout the U.S. This is an initiative that is funded by the Mellon Foundation. I'm only briefly going to introduce the panelists because some of the questions we have for them is for them to talk about themselves. So I'm not going to tell you a lot about them other than to say that we have with us today Olga Bautista, Executive Director of the Southeast Environmental Task Force. We're always so grateful and pleased to have Olga with us. Alfredo Romo, another busy environmental justice leader, Executive Director of Neighbors for Environmental Justice. Amy Sanchez is Program Director of the Warehouse Workers for Justice. Jose Miguel Acosta Cordova, Senior Transportation Policy Analyst, Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, Alvejo in the house. And Rose Gomez, ISFA Grassroots Organizer from the Pilsen Environmental Rights and Reform Organization. Thank you to all of you for your time and your presence here. We're very, very grateful. So let's begin with the personal. We would like each of you to share your own story and how you came to do environmental justice work. We're going to begin with Olga.
Okay, how much time do we have again?
A couple of minutes.
Okay.
We'll give you lots of time to fill it in.
I had to do a timer because I'm very long-winded, I've been told. My name is Olga Bautista. I'm the co-executive director, so I have a new co-director, Oscar Sanchez. So folks might know Oscar. I had to give ups to him. He was one of the hunger strikers that was in a hunger strike for 30 days to stop General Iron from relocating from the Lincoln Park neighborhood to our neighborhood. And I'm on the far southeast side of Chicago. My family is from Mexico. My mom's from Jalisco. My dad's from Nayarit. And even in their small little towns in Mexico, that in the 70s, they heard that there was work along the El Lago, Michigan. And they made their way all the way up here to work in the steel mills. And shortly after that, one by one, the steel mills started to close in the southeast side. And I got involved in environmental justice issues. My little sister was actually a student here at UIC and was volunteering at the Southeast Environmental Task Force, where I'm the co-director now, and she told me about a campaign to start a coal gasification plant, literally in the same site where General Iron was trying to move their facility. And essentially, you know, when Illinois has like all this coal, and there was the coal plants that were closed, and a lot of coal and nothing to do with it. So they came up with this idea to gasify coal. They would use 10 million gallons. I look at Rachel when I say this because they're going to use 10 million gallons of water from the Calumet River a day, and then put it back in, and that's kind of what we see happening in Ohio and other places where there's like all these algal blooms from the water that is sterile like that and waste, and that stuff grows and it's a huge problem. So I got involved in this campaign and it actually won. Like at first, that campaign had lost in the House and in the Senate, in the state in Springfield. But then the community organized and sent over 20,000 pieces of mail to, at that time, Governor Quinn, and then he vetoed the bill because the company wasn't going to break ground to gasify coal until they could lock in the 3 utility companies in Illinois to get their energy from that plant. So that was the bill that died. And it was actually going to raise the energy prices for a lot of the like NIPSCO and Waukegan. I forgot what the name of the company was there, and then in Chicago. So that was my first campaign, and then like it was like opening Pandora's box. I got involved in other campaigns, and we started to work with institutions like UIC and other institutions to gather data, because the onus, like for us to like prove that there was a problem, that onus was on the community. Like companies could apply for a permit and they didn't have to prove that they weren't causing harm. We had to prove that it was causing harm, like the everyday regular, everyday people. So that's how I got involved in environmental justice in my neighborhood, and I'll stop
Perfect.
there because I think
Perfect, thank
there'll be
you.
more.
Amy, we're going to go to you next. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in justice work?
Absolutely. My name is Amy Sanchez. I'm a Joliet girl born and raised on the east side of Joliet. My story is a little bit different than most of my colleagues up here on the panel. My story is embedded in street violence, gang violence to be specific. I'm a survivor of gun violence. As a child, I was shot in the head by a stray gang bullet intended for someone else. I was in a coma for 11 days. I wasn't expected to walk, talk, or be in anything but a vegetative state. I advocated and became an instant advocate in my community against gang violence, later learning that some of the very initiatives that I advocated for was complicit to mass incarceration for my Black, brown, and low-income brothers and sisters in the community. And then for a long time, I just wanted to advocate for specific things, more jobs, more accessibility, more this, and I realized that all of our lanes, if you put us on a map, and where is the biggest health inequalities, where is the largest pollution, where is the most impacted in water that we're drinking, all of those things are the same maps. The housing crisis, everything, the injustice that we see is all root causes and systemic causes of racism and violence. I became the program director of Warehouse Workers for Justice, and I feel like I learned the cheat codes when I learned organizing from a different perspective. So my colleagues that are on the panel, as well as those in policy and environmental justice at Warehouse Workers for Justice, are on the front lines doing this work. But I am certainly here to be an advocate and an uplifter, and a little bit more older and seasoned to share the history of how this is not just a targeted issue of environmental justice, but this is a very much systemic, targeted on race, on income, on gender, on so many different lanes that we're being attacked. So that's where my advocacy starts, and that is where I continue to advocate for reproductive justice and access, restorative justice and access, environmental justice. We're all in this together.
Thank you so much, Amy. Rose?
Hi, everyone. My name is Rose Gomez, and I'm a PERO organizer, which stands for Pilsen Environmental Rights Reform Organization. I had started as an environmentalist as an undergraduate at UIC. I am an alumni from here, and I remember, like if it was yesterday, I had seen an advertisement with the Sierra Club, and it was something that was inviting anyone that was interested to go to one of their meetings. So that's where I started, is with the Sierra Club as an environmentalist, because I felt that something was very wrong. The way we were progressing and the way everything seems to have changed to where we're headed. And of course, now today, it's the worst that we have ever have been at. Everything is getting worse. The climatic catastrophes, migration, people are leaving their countries in order to find a better place, in order to find a better living for themselves. They're trying to find something that is normal compared to what it was 15, 20 years ago. But we've been knowing the science for decades, but still we're at a point now where we're up against the wall, and it really is, I think, a matter of life and death. I've been doing this for decades as far as fighting for different environmental causes. What got me into peril was the coal power plant Fisk and Crawford. I would see it on my way to school because I used to live in Little Village. So I would take the Pulaski bus going southbound because I used to go to a high school that was a little bit south. So I would see the smokestack, which was Crawford, because at the time I was a resident at Little Village. So that's what started me out, was that campaign, which was compromise of many, many different organizations. And this was not only in Illinois, but also across the country, the closure of those two coal power plants, Fisk and Crawford. That's how I got involved with Peril. I felt that there was a connection, even though I didn't live in Pilsen, but I felt that connection. And I've been with Peril since 2010 as an organizer slash member and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of battles. There's constant battles to be fought. So the energy, you guys, it's never boring. There's always a fight. There's always a battle.
And we're going
To
to have
win.
a chance to get into some of those battles. So, Jose, we'll go to you, and then Alfredo will wrap up with you on this question.
Good afternoon. My name is Jose Acosta Cordova. I'm with Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. I'm the Senior Transportation Policy Analyst. I lead most of our transportation policy work, which includes work locally, work at the state level, work at the federal level, and most of that is around freight, other transportation, mobility justice issues as well. But I think, yeah, for me, I am somebody who actually was born into the movement, and I feel like activism is actually a really key part of my family's history. So both of my parents were actually involved in well, they kind of came of age during the Chicano movement, and they were both the first in their families to get degrees. On my dad's side, my dad was born and raised here in Chicago, but my grandfather, he actually was a baracero. I don't know if everybody's familiar with the baracero program, but it was a federal program to bring workers here, to bring farm workers from Mexico. So he actually was in California for many years, and then he got deported in 1954 under Operation Wetback, which of course a racist policy by the federal government to deport people, deport Mexicans back to the motherland. And in 1956, when my grandma was pregnant with my dad, they actually migrated here to Chicago, to the near west side, where we currently stand, in the UIC campus, which of course was, as many people know, was constructed after the displacement of a large population of Mexican, African American, Puerto Rican, and other low-income, working-class European groups as well. But where UIC was actually constructed was predominantly Mexican. And this is when, of course, everybody gets displaced. They go to Pilsen. This is when Pilsen becomes Pilsen as we know it. So that was my dad's first experience really with racial justice issues and displacement. And later on, then he would become very active in Pilsen during the 70s and 80s during the Chicano movement. And also both of my grandparents would become factory workers. This building actually that we're in right now was once an undergarment factory, and my grandma was actually worked in this building. So I actually came to school here I got my undergrad and my master's here at UIC in urban planning, so shout out to the MUPs in the room, any UIC folks. But for me to be able to get my degree in the building that my grandma once worked in as a factory worker was just crazy to think about, right? And then my grandpa was a factory worker as well on the west side at the Brock's Candy Factory. On my mom's side, they were more, so my dad's side was more immigrant, came from Jalisco. My mom's side actually was in New Mexico, southern Colorado for hundreds and hundreds of years. A lot of indigenous, Apache blood on that side. And actually my grandpa was a coal miner. He was a coal miner for many years and ultimately passed away before I was born from the black lung, right? So for me, I feel like my ancestors brought me here to do this work because of that. Both of my parents, like I said, would later go on to get their degrees. My dad was heavily involved here on campus. If people are familiar with all the struggles that happened here around getting the Latino Studies program created, the Latino Cultural Center, the Latinidades. My dad was actually a part of all those struggles in the 70s. So that legacy is, of course, with me. My mom was in California, was heavily involved with anti-apartheid work in the Berkeley area. And so racial justice, environmental justice, all these things were a major part of my life from the time I was born. I left here. I was born here in Chicago. I left here when I was 3. I was raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the what we call the heart of the Chicano barrio. Right, if anybody's familiar with the Southwest side or the Southwest part of the country, very similar to the Southwest side here in Chicago. But my neighborhood was like 95%, Chicano, Mexicano growing up, and I saw a lot of those issues, right, of policing, of violence, of oppression, systematic racism, all these things. But then also having both of my parents be involved with the environmental justice movement from the time I was 3-4 years old, really shaped who I am as a person. I don't remember exactly how old I was the first time I was dragged to a demonstration, but I know I was at least 3 or 4 years old, and I had this little wagon that my dad would pull me in. I'm there carrying a sign, not really knowing what I'm doing. Of course, I'm a little kid, but when I was 8, if anybody's familiar with the Gemes principles, the democratic organizing, this took place in Gemes Pueblo in New Mexico. I was actually there. I was a little travieso running around. Again, didn't really know what I was the significance of me being there meant. And fast forward to then, I moved back to Chicago, 2013, did my undergrad here, my master's, and then I got a position was open at El Vejo. I applied, so that's about 5.5 years ago now. And fast forward to now, here I am, on this panel with these amazing people doing this great work. So for me, this is a lifelong thing that I feel like my ancestors brought me here to do, and this will continue to be my work going forward.
Nice. Alfredo.
Wow, that's actually very inspiring to continue to hear all these stories from these panelists and colleagues doing this environmental justice work. For me, my name is Alfredo Romo. I am the executive director of Neighbors for Environmental Justice. This is a very young organization that came into this work back in 2018 due to Med Asphalt. This is a company came into our community without any notification, any community involvement, let alone any benefits to the McKinley Park residents. At this point in time, the way that I started to get involved in this work, I came into this work in a very organic manner. I actually used to work for warehousing, manufacturing, and chemical companies. I also grew up in Little Village. I'm also a gun victim twice. So I got to experience social issues, right? Immigration issues, economic issues, labor issues. You talk about environmental justice issues as well. So I got to experience this at a very young age. I used to notice that, I was very boxed in, right? With regards to education, resources, job opportunities as well. So at that point, I really started to, once again, trying to, get involved in different areas of organizing. And when I got sick, I was actually given 6 months to live, and this is my 15-year remission. And here in McKinley Park, we had this beautiful, beautiful park where, I remember during those, dark days, I would go to the park just to reconnect to nature, open up my lungs a little bit, and to, try to, once again, go through my remission process. And back in 2018, in the winter months, I noticed this facility in front of us, or in front of the park, I should say, that was not there before, right? And at that point, I was very troubled to see an industrial development in close proximity to our built environments. At that point in time, just because I had that experience of working for these industries, I knew that they have a hard time containing their pollution within their premises. And so I brought that information back to my family, to my friends, to my neighbors, to local schools that I was actually connected to, and the rest is history. We started to mobilize. We put together some community meetings just to continue to, understand how was it that city governance completely failed the McKinley Park community in allowing this company to come in, once again, adjacent to our park, next door to schools, and 1,000 feet from residential homes. At this point in time, it's very important to understand that, when it comes to planning, development, and zoning, and decision-making processes that are connected to those layers, it's very crucial, right? And it's not even crucial; it's vital to scrutinize and to bring that level of exposure to hold the city and the state accountable, because they're the ones who are responsible of protecting the community's environmental health. At this point in time, I think that also made us understand that we needed to go deeper into this work. So it went from mobilization to community organizing, and now we're doing some sort of like advocacy, right? Now we're at the table, and we're not just happy to be at the table. We want to be at the table, and for our participation to be meaningful, and to also be substantial. So I think that the work that we have done for the last 5 years has really demonstrated that it's very important to continue to connect the dots of environmental racism with multiple public campaigns. The fight of General Iron in the southeast side, the Hilco fiasco in Little Village, and of course, many other issues that are happening with Sims in Pilsen, and even going to Joliet, because I-55 connects, the Joliet issue, right? With regards to trucking, all these goods, transporting from one side to another, it continues to bring more warehousing, more trucking activity into our areas that are already overburdened with pollution. So I think that once again, it's very important to show the level of support, solidarity, and to continue to really uplift the voices of these marginalized communities.
Fantastic. It's very important to see how this work is so personal for each of you, and how it connects to your family histories, including their workplaces, and how it relates to what's happening in your neighborhoods. You have all alluded to how your work intersects with trends of history, whether industrial, labor, immigration, or environmental histories. Jose, can you provide us with some additional context for understanding how we got here? And perhaps you can address the history of the development of the sanitary and ship canal, including its function for industrial activity and canal development.
So I'm gonna give you a little preview of some of my PhD dissertation work here. But yeah, I mean, I think in order to understand even how we got into this mess with transportation, all that stuff, it's important to understand, right, how we got here and like all the history, because the construction of the Illinois and Michigan Canal is really the most important infrastructure investment the city of Chicago has ever engaged in. Initially, the Illinois-Michigan Canal, and then it was replaced by the sanitary and ship canal. But like the story of Chicago, this doesn't get told enough, right? And I think that's intentional, because if it were to be told, then the story of indigenous removal in the region would have to be more at the forefront, right? This narrative, this mainstream narrative that we get of Dusable settling in the area, and then white European immigrants coming in and building up the area, off their hard work, and that mainstream narrative would be completely erased. And because, the fact is that Chicago has always been a crucial region for the movement of goods, for trade, right? But going back to when indigenous peoples were here, they had a well-established network of trails based on water, based on land, that they would use to engage with people all throughout the Great Lakes, potentially as far west as the Rocky Mountains, as far south as the Gulf of Mexico, and as far east as the Atlantic Ocean. And the reason for this is because they understood the significance of the geography, right? In Chicago, we're between the two most important water systems in North America, the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, right? These two water systems connect, like I said, they connect as far west, the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico, and pretty far north as well, that you could access based on water, right? So when Europeans started coming into the region, even like 100 years before the official, first settlement of Chicago was established, it was Joliet and Marquette, and they're credited with being the first people to think about this idea of a canal. I think that's of course from the perspective of them. So we don't know, how, but we know that indigenous peoples were using, canoes and portaging between waterways, right, carrying their canoes to get from one body of water to the next to get around. And the story goes that that Europeans, Marquette and Joliet, were like, yo, if we build a canal right here, we can actually connect these two water systems, right, where the Chicago River ends to, the Des Plaines River and ultimately to the Mississippi River, right? And 100 years later, then this plan starts to come to fruition when the town of Chicago gets established, and there's a series of treaties that are that the indigenous peoples agreed to, right? That ultimately forced their removal from the area. And it's literally 1833, the Treaty of Chicago, right, was signed, and that's the same exact year that they actually started construction on the Illinois-Michigan Canal. So this is not by accident that this happened, right? And the significance of this canal and connecting Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River and making it possible to take a boat then from the East Coast all through the Great Lakes into the central part of the country was critical not only to Chicago's growth, but also to the growth of the U.S. And I think that's a really critical element, right? Think about 1848, what was happening during this time period, right? The U.S. is still internally colonizing the central part of the U.S., right? We had just won the U.S.-Mexico War, got all this new land, right? So they wanted to, and of course this is before rail, this is before automobiles, and water was our most important way of bringing goods into the central part of the country. So then building this canal then put Chicago on a path of becoming the most important inland geographic point for the movement of goods. Ultimately, then the railroads followed. We had a huge network of railroads get built post 1848. We eventually become the rail hub of North America, right? The place where all 6 Class 1 railroads converge. We have more rail yards than any other part of the country, and it all ties back to our waterways. So I'll try to keep it brief. Fast forward into 1900, right? We replaced the Illinois-Michigan Canal, and in the replacing of that, we do two important things. We widen it and we deepen it to allow for bigger ships, but also we reverse the flow of the Chicago River away from the lake, right? This protects our source of drinking water. Of course, we have been polluting these sources of water by this point for 50 years, and a lot of that pollution was going into the lake, right? So this is our source of drinking water. We had a lot of waterborne diseases, so we had to protect that water source. So in doing that, then and cementing these canals and the land adjacent to it as industrial, this set us on the path that we're on to right now, right? So all these areas along the waterways, then you had the construction of the Calumet, the Sac Channel in 1921, right? So if you look on your maps that were shared with you, you can see how all these waterways are connected, right? And we created this large network of water-based transport that really, again, made Chicago the most important inland geographic point. And the area like I said, the area around the waterways, the area around the railroads, they were cemented as industrial. And, the last point I'll make is that fast forward to like modern day times, right? We go through this deindustrialization period, starting really heavily in the 70s and 80s. And a lot of that land that was formerly used for factories or for other heavy manufacturing was then replaced by logistics, by the large rail yards that were used for bringing in cattle and beef, for example, for the stockyards in back of the yards was converted to an intermodal rail facility, right, where we're bringing in shipping containers from the West Coast and the East Coast. But all that said, right, we transformed from being a heavy industrial city to being a city that's based on logistics, and that's why all of our communities, whether it's Joliet, whether it's the southwest side, the southeast side, we're all dealing with the impacts of that, right, and decisions that were made by our local and political leaders to embrace this new emerging economy and sacrifice certain communities in the process. So that's where we're at. So I know it's a little bit of a long history, but I think it's important to understand, how we got to this point, because it wasn't by accident that we're the most important logistics city in North America, including any port city. But by the way, we actually would be the second busiest port city in North America by container volume and the 10th busiest in the world. So we are very much a port city, even though we are not located on the coast. So I think it's a really critical part of why we're doing this work that we are.
And it really sets the context, I think, for not only the topic, today, looking at environmental justice issues along the waterways, right? But helps us then explain what some of those specific environmental justice issues are. Olga, can you speak to how this industrial legacy continues to impact neighborhood conditions in Southeast Chicago? For example, is there still contamination left behind by the steel mills being closed? And are you continuing to see a concentration of heavy industry in this area?
Yeah, it's really interesting because we often refer to what's happening like a post-industrial, like with the post-industrial frame, but it's hard for us, like in the southeast side, to think this is like post because there was a shift when the steel mills closed. The area was still zoned for like the dirtiest of the dirtiest kind of industries. And because it's still a logistical hub, what we saw was a lot of bulk storage, like being held on the banks of the Calumet River. One of the campaigns that I didn't talk about was the pet coke campaign. BP across the like 5 minutes from my house. It's like on the Indiana border. Had gone through this massive upgrade, like a $5 billion upgrade, to be able to process tar sands that were coming from Alberta, Canada, on pipelines. Rachel will tell us, dangerously close. Also, did I just say, like, I feel so much pressure because I love these women so much, and I'm in a university. I dropped out of college. and okay. So I just want to say, so I'm just like, all these people are about to fact check me right
I got you, same sis.
Okay, so I'm trying to be as accurate and also vague and generalizing some things. So yeah, BP goes through this crazy upgrade, and they're piping these tar sands. And if folks have seen, like when we talk about how these issues, what we're experiencing here are actually like global. There's like decisions about trade and all kinds of things like happening on a global level. This is what it's looking like for our little corner of the Great Lakes, right? So then we have these pipelines bringing tar sands, devastating Alberta, Canada. Like some of the biggest earth movers on the planet are there getting and just like destroying forest, and it's just absolutely a disgrace what's happening in Alberta, Canada. They pipe that stuff down, and then they make all kinds of things. The petrol, fuel for airplanes, and then a bunch of other, but they don't just make gas for vehicles, they make jet fuel, all kinds of things. And there's also this waste, we call it, it's a waste, but it's actually an ingredient, petroleum coke. It's like a powder, it's very fine, it was blowing around the community. It was being stored on the banks of the Calumet River. It was getting into people's like backyard pools. You know how it looks when you see a puddle and there's like this iridescent like film when you know there's like oil or something in that water. That's how everybody's backyard pool looked, and like their water dish for their pets in the yard. And it was just blowing around willy-nilly. We actually stored the coal that was used in the coal plants in Pilsen and Little Village in our neighborhood, but that was also a problem, but not as bad. So we actually didn't notice, the neighborhood didn't know that it wasn't coal anymore, and it was now pet coke, and it was flying around, and it was getting into people's homes. Just like coincidentally, the owners of the facility were also the Koch brothers, who are these oil barons. One of them's passed away. There's only one Koch brother left, and they are like some of the richest humans on the planet. And it doesn't matter who's in office. They just want to be able to continue operating, right? They support everybody as long as they can get their. Nothing will interfere with their business. But so anyway, it was a sensational issue because Dick Durbin hated the Koch brothers. So he's like, I'm going to help you fight your fight. And he got the US EPA involved and all these folks, the CDC involved. They put air monitors. But these air monitors picked up a bunch of other stuff too. So we were able to secure new policies in the city of Chicago. We also did our own DIY data collection at this time, and we collected data. It was an icy, snowy day. The river was completely white because of the ice that had just fallen on the frozen river, and the pet coke had it looked like somebody put a pepper shaker, and it was all dusted with pet coke. But we used this big DIY method, this big weather balloon. We filled it up with helium, and we had this is before drones were available so easily, and we had a camera like on continual shutter inside of an ocean spray juice container that we like rigged up with rubber bands and a little stone from the ground to hold it in a continual shutter. Let that baby go, and it took pictures and it got the image. And actually that image was what the Attorney General used to get involved and to like shut down everything. So it's just like crazy how things work. But yeah, I mean, to just continue to answer your question, there are a ton of things that are still happening, that like the way that our neighborhoods are still being impacted. Right now, what we're like, we we tried all the things. Like we've tied ourselves across, the entrance of the Petco company. There's been a 30-day hunger strike. There's been door knocking. There's been phone banking. I freaking ran for office. My colleague Oscar Sanchez ran. And yeah, like we have always been met with like immense resistance, even threats to our lives. Like it's just, it's crazy. It's like the Wild West. These companies have their own organization called the Calumet Area Industrial Commission. And the CAIC essentially like supports these industries and is there as a resource, for workforce development, but also for how to overcome these kind of campaigns. So the last thing I'll say is like, capital is gonna find its way, okay? It's gonna find its way. What we're seeing now, Ozinga is started another company. Like we all know Ozinga does cement. Everybody sees the big red and white cement trucks across the city of Chicago. They want to have a closed loop system in our neighborhood. They have a place where they process their cement. They have silos that they rent, and they want to dig really close to where General Iron is supposed to move. They want to mine limestone, but they created this whole narrative. They like greenwashed their whole operation and said like, this is not mining, this is excavating. We're actually going to create an underground storage facility, like 500 feet underground, like 8 floors. Something like this already exists in Kansas. I believe it's called I forgot what it's called actually. I'm thinking Subterranean now, but it's not. That's a club in Chicago. That's not it. So these things are still happening, and even with the resistance, and even with like moving elected officials to do the right thing, we're seeing that capital, that business industry is still going to find its way. So this company actually started another little company so that they wouldn't be tied to it. Opened a visitor center in our neighborhood. Has like bought the Little League field, thrown out the first pitch for Little Leagues, donated to schools, and creating a situation, and poached 2 people from our campaign, especially like during the pandemic when people needed jobs, offered well-paid jobs. So then there's this confusion in the community. It's like, oh, hey, we saw what you guys are doing. This is pretty cool. We're gonna have green jobs. And I'm like, that's not us. So yeah, like our work has constantly, like there is no resting on your laurels. Like once you've fought to like do one thing, and like we just keep winning more work for ourselves. And yeah, we still have just an array. You could throw a rock and you'll hit an environmental justice issue. So these issues still persist.
The struggle is siempre la lucha, right?
Siempre.
The struggle is protracted. I hadn't heard that story before about the ocean spray. That's pretty wow, that's pretty innovative. Rose, what are you seeing in Pilsen?
There's, right now, currently, we're working with organizations related to SIMS, and SIMS is a method spreader. SIMS is alongside the river, and they've been polluting ever since the 90s. And they do have monitors that detect what the particulate matter is that's going into the air. But the problem right now is that the monitors are not as sensitive as they could be, so a lot of particulate matter is not being detected, and there is no numerical values for certain particulate matter, which includes lead, manganese, chromium, just to name a few. And that's very important, especially because Pilsen is an environmental justice community, so we should know those numerical numbers. But the EPA does not disclose that information just because they haven't been pushed or haven't been persuaded enough. So that's one of the battles right now, as far as what's happening in Pilsen. And we are looking for volunteers. It's a small group, so especially younger people, I would say, if possible, to get involved, only because you guys are going to face most of the consequences that we're facing for the near future. Me, myself, I'm older, so I'm going to face, of course, consequences, but not as much as you guys. You guys have more at stake, and you guys have boundless energy. I could see it. You guys have so many tools, such as technology and other technical advances that I myself didn't have, years ago, decades ago. But there's so much that one person can do, and it's all about making a difference. I really see that that's the only way to go. That's how I became involved. I just didn't want to be a bystander and then just let things walk on by, pass on by. I have one son, and that's another reason how I got involved, because I didn't want to be a bystander and see his future be worse than what my future was going to be. People have so much potential and power to the people, and that's the only way that things are going to change, is power to the people. That's it. You could have technology to help us out, but it's not the same as talking to people and connecting with people, and that's what I think is the most powerful force. Everything else, you forget about it, or it's secondary, but connecting with people, that's what creates the ripple effect for tomorrow.
It seems that land use in the city of Chicago that used to have heavier industry has been converted to commercial or residential, for example, on the north side. Is this showing up as more concentration of industry in the southeast and southwest sides? Alfredo, what's happening in McKinley Park neighborhood, and what is some of that impact of that concentration down there?
I mean, we continue to see these patterns, when it comes to city planning. The city has about 24, 26 industrial corridors. And one of the things that I have learned through the last 5 years of organizing is that, the industrial corridors of the north side, they're being modernized, and they continue to redirect heavy industry into the southwest side, into the southeast side. I really encourage all of you here to take a look at 3 maps. The NRDC map, this is the Natural Resource Defense Council, put together a map that speaks to the cumulative impacts and also the social characterizations of these communities. The other map was produced by Chicago Department of Public Health. This map speaks to the air quality and also the health index. And there's a third map, I just don't remember if it has a particular name to it, but it was produced by the Department of Planning and Development. And this map pretty much identifies all these, facilities that are major concerns to an EJ community. These maps, once you put them side by side, it really sort of illustrates what environmental racism looks like. And I think at the end of the day, the southeast side and the southwest side continue to become like the black lungs of the city's infrastructure. That's one of the things that we continue to see in McKinley Park. McKinley Park is surrounded by 3 industrial corridors, an industrial corridor to the south of us, an industrial corridor to the east, and also the industrial corridor to the north along the I-55 highway, which is also connected to the canal. Just going back to Mad Asphalt, this is a perfect campaign that is going to become a case study once again, to continue to bring the level of exposure to planning, development, implementation, and enforcement. And that's what we do, right? We're going to get involved. We're going to continue to identify, more, EJ issues within their communities. We are seeing more warehousing, making that connection to I-55 and Joliet. Right now, I believe there's 34 TDLs across the city of Chicago, but 31 out of the 34 are south of the Roosevelt Road. So once again, most of these things continue to be redirected into, vulnerable communities. And one of the reasons that we continue to see is that why we are targeted, right? We don't have economic power. We don't have political will. As a matter of fact, Met Asphalt, back in 2018, this is how cynical, city governance and policies can be. Our elder person, George Cardenas, during that time, he was actually the chair of the Environment and Health Committee of the City of Chicago, at the same time receiving contributions from Met Asphalt to facilitate and to pretty much, allow the company to come in close proximity to our park, 1,000 feet from homes and next door to schools. I think another thing that I would like to speak to is that, some of these public campaigns can also become very hyper-local. I would like to continue to challenge that aspect, right? Sometimes we become very NIMBY. If it's not affecting me, well, then good luck to you, right? At the same time, Met Asphalt, this park is a 72-acre park where it's not just for community residents of McKinley Park, but it also provides that open green space for neighboring communities to come to this park and to connect to that park. In addition to the 2 schools that this company is affecting directly, there's 7 schools and 5 daycares within the vicinity of the community. So most of these schools and daycares, they bring the kids to the park. Now we are being sacrificed not to do that because now they're aware of our campaign and the heavy impacts. So now they're walking away from the park. At the same time, there's a lot of teachers that are coming from other areas of the city of Chicago to work in within these EJ communities on a daily basis. So they're also being impacted. And that goes to showcase that even though it might look like a hyper-local situation, it's really affecting many other Chicago residents as well. But also it speaks to other heavy industries that are also in these other communities that are doing the same thing that Met Asphalt is doing. Right now, Met Asphalt is actually operating with an expired permit. We actually scrutinized the situation so much that the IEPA rejected their operating permit. If you can believe that, we got involved in the procurement processes of the city of Chicago, where we basically challenged Met Asphalt in trying to obtain $500 million city contracts. We were very concerned about that because if they were able to obtain that level of city contracts, their emissions were going to increase and their trucking diesel were going to quadruple. So we got involved. We applied so much pressure that the city of Chicago rejected their $500 million city contracts. At the same time, we do have mixed feelings about it because 2 months ago, they were able to strike a settlement where they were able to get $141 million. Another thing that I would like to completely speak to is that we are also surrounded by arterial roads that once again that bring a significant amount of diesel pollution into our traffic. To our communities. As a matter of fact, Jose Acosta, did some work with us to identify some of these key intersections. And there's an intersection on Pershing and Western, and I forget the numbers, but I think there are roughly around 2,100 trucks based on 24-hour cycle. In addition to that, 3,000 mid-size and school buses that are passing through that intersection. At the same time, the city continues to redirect more warehousing into these areas that are already encapsulated by diesel pollution and also cumulative impacts with multiple companies operating in close proximity to our community.
Thank you, Alfredo. Amy, both Jose now and Alfredo have talked about the emergence of this continually growing logistics industry in the region. Joliet is an area with a heavy industrial footprint, and besides the presence of the petrochemical activity, there are increasing numbers of warehouses and logistics facilities. How has this transformed Joliet, and what are some of the environmental, including water and worker impacts?
Thank you. just hearing this and how we're talking about it's not isolated, we're not like NIMBYs.
Yeah.
Joliet has always been connected to Chicago in one format or another, be it the canals, our prison system, or now the various highways and logistics facilities that we have. A similar study was done in Joliet, Will County, in the highest trafficked area, which is the corner of Illinois 53 and Laraway Road, where a lot of the industrial hubs begin, if you will. And in the study and report that was showing is the air quality study, where we had similar air monitors being tested and truck counting done by a host of volunteers and young folks that were very involved. And in a 45-minute time frame, they're counted over 1,000 trucks, not to mention the small-sized vehicles. And on our hottest day and our most heaviest truck traffic, we're looking at 3 deaths a day. And when they gave that report, with underlying chronic diseases. And when they gave that report and they asked for our feedback for those of us that live in the community, one of the first things I uplifted is those aren't numbers to me, those are names. Those are people that live in that community. My mother lives a few blocks away from that very intersection. Very young people in our community. We have several schools right in that area as well. The expansion that has happened, so Joliet is divided by the Des Plaines River. And that has always been a racial divide. And even though the city has drastically expanded westward into our city limits, there is parts of unincorporated Joliet, and I would be remiss if I didn't uplift their concerns, because they're not on the water system and on the aquifer. They're literally separate water systems. It was probably in the last 10 years, Ridgewood, which is known as not a rural, but a very low-income white community, predominantly white community and Latino community, had raw sewage running down the road, literally within the last 10 years, just started getting off of that. Preston Heights, which is heavily African-American community, that has the highest number per density in a whole entire region of sex offenders as well as violence, is also like yards away, like not even 2 yards away from the Amazon facilities, which are right in our community. So unfortunately, the city of Joliet has expanded without even thought of the water infrastructure, the roads at all. Like, these were literally before the Center Point Intermodal came. There is, it's tied up in legal right now, but North Point Development that has gotten the green light and approval already by our elected officials to build a huge intermodal hub is supposed to be 10 times the size of Midway Airport. And you're talking about rural residential roads that were literally gravel roads prior to them paving it and just expecting the infrastructure to sustain. And to talk about the water aquifer that the city of Joliet currently has water on, it is set to sunset. It is going to implode. It's going to collapse by 2030. There's not enough drinking water to sustain. And currently, several of our industries, including some of our chemical, which they say is recycled, but that's debatable, are all on the city's aquifer. So they've just recently voted to approve water increases. Some of the expectations were 3 times that it would increase 3 times over the next several years, and the realistic is that it would increase 6 times over the next several years, what it currently is. Thankfully, we have some policymakers and some decision makers that have literally and aggressively put in some preferences. It was a 2-tier system, now it's a 3-tier system. But I go back to some of the points that I wanted to make sure that that I referenced was this is literally, not only is it targeted and it is intentional environmental justice in a sacrifice zone for the air quality and the water pollution and the water usage, but the targeted, overwhelmingly, warehouses and logistics get built, but the people that the long-term sustainable jobs that they're employing are all third-party logistics or temp services, for lack of better terms. Overwhelmingly, they're hiring Black and Latinos and undocumented folks at a high rate for temp services. They have no benefits, they have no livable wages, they have no promise, and a lot of those are ripple effects from mass incarceration. They've been impacted, or their families have been impacted by incarceration. They're coming back to communities where they don't have livable wage jobs. So the steel industry that was once there, and one point I definitely want to make mention, like one of the largest blue collar jobs, if you will, where you were able to buy a home with was, the steel industry in Joliet. U.S. Steel abandoned their facilities there right on Collins Street in the largest Latino community in the area. And it's such a brown site that it needed to have a groundwater ordinance proposal. And it's literally, I got to sit in a meeting with IEPA and the department heads for U.S. Steel because it had been sitting for so long, untouched, undeveloped. We've had potential buyers to come in, and U.S. Steel just sits on it because they know it's a brownfield. While simultaneously, the small business community has poured millions of dollars throughout Collins Street to take it from the high crime-ridden area. And this is all along the same lines as the old Joliet prison that was also abandoned by the state at one point. And now the community and different partners and historic preservationists are trying to rebuild that prison and make it in such a way that it is mindful in telling the story of mass incarceration. But those small businesses that were pouring millions of dollars, and here U.S. Steel gets away with leaving it a brown site. And then the small community that's of residential residents that live off of Collins Street are impacted by that well and that water. So the U.S. Steel did a workaround, and instead of going through the city to get a groundwater ordinance and pay for all the testing, they went through a back way through IEPA and got an approval to leave the wells as is. So saying all that to say, like, it is literally transformed that Des Plaines River. Like, after Dr. King was assassinated, the elected officials and police department literally raised the bridges to keep the protests and the demonstrations from going westward, where all the wealthy lawyers, doctors, and then were. And then after, there was a thriving black business district there. The Latino district was not built yet in the sense of a business district, but after that, the county gave a very short window for that thriving black business district to rebuild, and of course, their insurance wouldn't cover riots as they claimed they were, and they took their land by eminent domain, and currently the Will County Jail sits where that thriving black business district once was. It adds insult to injury, and that is a story that I tell often because the thriving Hispanic business district, the Latino business district, and I tell them often, history repeats itself. And because we are so mirrored and so close together in this big, small town of Joliet, we have to learn from each other's history. Because if we're not vigilant and we're not in solidarity, the same things then happen again if we are not careful. And then if you go post-George Floyd, when demonstrations were happening, the drawbridges were put up again to keep people from coming to the downtown area to impact the new courthouse that was just recently built. So those bridges and that westward expansion has always been a way to divide the community by race and by class, and it definitely has an impact on our water infrastructure. Right now, the City of Joliet, as well as other partners, are trying to do a campaign to tell residents how to preserve water, take fewer showers, and all of these rebates to get a flushing toilet, and all the things that we would like to do as well. But there is not a campaign, and they're using taxpayer dollars to do this campaign for residents to save water, but they're not doing those same efforts for industry. And we've asked those questions. The senior rate for the water bill is currently $5 a month for senior citizens on a fixed income, and they just increased their rates. So it's definitely impacting, and it's definitely a footprint that is not manageable. Very, very small town-minded policies that have been historic that need to change drastically.
Thank you. That's really powerful. And embedded in much of what you said is that connection between environmental justice and worker justice. I'll say very briefly, can you just tell us what is just transition?
So a just transition is actually an economic framework that was created by, what's his name, Tom?
I'm blanking. He was with the
Atomic
oil and petrochemical workers.
Atomic Workers Union in the early 90s, actually, because he was somebody who had worked on the front lines, right, of these industries, and he understood that the pollution that they were exposed to was also harming workers, right? And so he approached EJ leaders and was like, we know that this is an issue, but at the same time, this is our livelihood, right? So how do we create a vision, an economic framework for what our future could look like as we decarbonize our economy? So this concept of a just transition is really about how we think about workers during this transition away from fossil fuels, from a carbon-based economy. So that means, number one, providing the job training that we're going to need, right? One of the things that started under the Climate Equitable Jobs Act that people like us and SCTF and others have been doing is the Solar for All program, right? We're training solar workers to install solar panels and other things related to solar energy. Those kinds of industries, right? The other emerging industries, we're talking a lot about diesel pollution. There's going to be a lot of electric trucks that are going to need to be built over this next 20, 30 years at least. So making sure that people who've been working in the industries are going to have opportunities, some of the earliest opportunities to get into these emerging industries. A job, for example, building electric vehicles on average, you're getting about 90,000 a year, which is most of some professors make. So I mean, there's really good opportunities that are going to be emerging in this new industry. So again, this concept of a just transition, there's actually a whole web that was created by EJ leaders and labor leaders around this shift away from our current structure of economics and governance to what this new one could look like. So for example, one of the things is like co-governance, so that there's more community ownership over the process. One of them is just more democracy in general. One of them is even just the way we look at the earth, right, in terms of extraction versus what's it called, extraction versus regeneration, right? So actually, if you look up Just Transition and look at the Climate Justice Alliance, they actually have that web where you can look at it and download it, and it really gives you a clear picture of what it is that we're trying to do when we build this new economy. Because one of the things that we can't do when we're building this green economy is keep things the way that they are, right? Where we have so much wealth inequality, where we have so much racial inequality, we have to build a new system of economics that doesn't kill our planet, that doesn't extract our resources from our planet, that doesn't extract labor from our people, that doesn't kill our people. So what that looks like is going to be really crucial, and ultimately who has control over that process is going to be really critical as well. So I know us as EJ organizations and labor organizations as well are huge advocates of a just transition, because we need to be thinking about the workers in this transition away from fossil fuels.
Thank you very much. Olga, so you've talked a lot about the concentration in the southeast side, and one of the complications that you're dealing with, or the complexities you're dealing with, is that area is zoned for that kind of heavy use, right? So this makes your organizing, complex and difficult. And I've heard Alfredo and a couple of the others of you have made reference to the notion of cumulative impact, and I know that your work has been very central to doing some organizing around establishing a cumulative impact ordinance. Can you speak a little bit about that ordinance and why it's so important?
The cumulative impact idea is not new. There's another city in Newark, New Jersey, who has passed cumulative impacts rules that will take into account not just like the amount of industry that's in one area, but also the way that it will impact the community based on different demographics, like high school attainment, income. Race is tricky because there's a new Supreme Court decision that can impact the way that we think about, the way that we make policies, specifically with like using indicators like race. The cumulative impacts ordinance for the city of Chicago, if it becomes a new policy, would require, well, actually, it's not written yet. So I'll start with that. Like, what we've done so far in the city of Chicago is do a cumulative impacts assessment. So Alfredo and I were really active in this process. We made a lot of interventions with the city and said, if we're going to do a cumulative impacts assessment, it's going to, require an acknowledgement that the city has wronged the community, right? So we can't fix a problem until there's like an acknowledgement that there is even a problem, and like these flawed policies and how it has concentrated so much industry in certain areas and the way that it impacts people. So if you would imagine if you had a polluting company, let's say in my neighborhood in the southeast side, and the same polluting company in Streeterville, okay? You have community that in Streeterville that probably has health insurance. They probably can take days off of work if they feel sick. They could have a nanny to watch the kids while they go to the doctor or something like that. Probably have, live in a place that the windows are sealed and the quality of air inside is not impacted by and like HVAC systems that are up to date and all the things. They might have air cleaners inside of their building and are not breathing in, toxic stuff. So in the past, or now, currently, when a company wants to move into McKinley Park or other areas where there's industrial corridors or applied manufacturing districts, they don't even have to let the alderman know. They check all the checklist, they meet the requirements, they fill in, and they almost always get the permit, and this cumulative impacts, the idea of taking this assessment that we did, we created a map with the city, and it was really, I feel like this is one of the first times in my lifetime that I was part of a process with the city where community groups were in the driver's seat. And when we needed more time to discuss the kind of indicators that we would use to make sure that the assessment was capturing our lived experience correctly, we needed more time, and we got that time. We said we can't move forward. We have to do more research. The way that we told the city also very early on when they said, well, we'll have to do a community engagement part of this work. We'll do get the data, but then we should also talk to people in the community. And then we said, wait a minute. We've been talking to you. We've been showing up to comment periods. We've been submitting letters for freaking years. Why don't you go back and dig that shit up and use that, use that information. Organizing, if anybody here is an organizer, if you run a club on campus or something, community engagement has been so much more difficult after COVID. So what they were asking us meant that we would have to have worked 10 times as hard to go out into the neighborhood and to get community input. So we said, we will do some of that, but you're also gonna have to take into account all the things that we have been saying to you for years, and they did it. There was some pushback here and there, but we were able to work on this process, and like anything, there are flaws, like data gaps, and it's not perfect, but we also have worked in some recommendations that we hope will show up in the policy, if my neighbor, we don't know what we don't know. So what if we made this policy and then a week later we uncover some gross negligence that's happening in a neighborhood by a company, like how we didn't know about Mad Asphalt? So we wrote that we recommended that the policy be written to also include self-designation for communities that are not highlighted high on the map, and there would be a process and things that they would have to do to be able to self-designate. And also, we recommended communities that are adjacent to areas that were really lit up on the map as problem areas or environmental justice communities, that there'll be some consideration if you're adjacent to those. So cumulative impact policy, like I said, is still we're still in that, it's actually being written right now. And this would be pretty historic.
It'd be very important.
It'd be very important.
Yeah. Alfredo, so you've talked a lot about McKinley Park and some of the issues there. Is there anything you want to add about some of the struggles you're involved in, or do you want to expound on the cumulative impact work?
I think I can sort of try to touch base on both, just very briefly. With regards to the cumulative impacts assessment, just to, add a little bit more context to the conversation here, is that it was very important for us, talking about the level of trust. For us, it's very hard as environmental justice organizations, right? Like to come to the table and to be part of a project that is connected to the city. Just because, once again, the city continues to, pretty much, they continue to create environmental barriers and obstacles to really make substantial changes when addressing EJ issues. I was very taken aback that we put together an engagement event in McKinley Park. It was perhaps the most attended throughout the assessment itself. Yet the ground truthing that we did in that presentation or in that event, it was not put into consideration when putting the map together. So the map itself is the baseline. At the same time, it does have some deficiencies, and those deficiencies need to be called out. And we need to really make sure that we speak to mechanisms to rectify that. That's one of the things that I was very troubled. This, public campaign has been happening for the last 5 years, so there's an abundance of material that we have on the issue. At the same time, all of that information, all of that data, all of that material was not put into consideration of this particular map. The assessment itself, it does have like 3 components to it. The assessment itself, which will create tools to measure the risk, the harm, the vulnerability of these areas. It will create the definition of environmental justice communities. It created the map of environmental justice communities once again. The data that was used in this assessment, it was quantitative data, connecting it to air quality, traffic, health risks. But also, I think that this is something that as community partners that we brought to the table was that we wanted to add qualitative data as well. The lived experiences of the communities that have been affected the most, especially the ones that have been taking the brunt of environmental racism. The drafting of the ordinance, I mean, I think that, right now, just because there's so much political scandal happening, it continues to, kick the can down the road with many of these, marquee demands, whether they're social or environmental. So I think at this point in time, we were hoping that this drafting of the ordinance will be produced by now to be introduced early September or in October. That has not been the case. Now we're pushing it to December, and I'm also concerned that that might not also be the case. So that might also be pushed into next year as well. The ordinance itself, one thing that we need to also be very aware of is that it has to pass by City Council to take effect. It will codify, once again, the definition of environmental justice communities. It will create new protections, or at least that's the hope, that it will create new protections for EJ communities to prevent further harm. I think the other one that I think Olga just, spoke to is, really making changes to rules to end the by right zoning, right? For heavy industries to come in to our areas, especially the overburdened communities, and for them to just be, once again, get the free pass from the city or the state. And I would like to also speak to something here where we have been applying so much pressure to Director Kim, the director of the IEPA. At the same time, he pushed back on one of the conversations that I had with him, that he basically told me to my face that they don't have the capacity to implement or enforce current environmental regulations, let alone any new provisions. And my response to him was, well, if you're telling me that you don't have capacity, why are you granting these air permits to these polluters? So the last one, which is very important to this assessment, which was also where the city committed to this, being part of the HUD agreement, is that we're asking the city to put these multiple city departments on notice for them to put together action plans to once again rectify EJ issues within these areas that we're very concerned. So these departments will create plans. They will focus on each department that can bring environmental justice into their own areas of work and operations. And these include the Department of Planning, of Development, Public Health, Transportation, Law, Housing, Buildings, Water Management, Procurement Services, assets, and information services. These are the departments that are at the table right now. We're hoping to continue to expand that a little more with other departments as well. And I think the other portion was.
Well, just if there's anything else that you wanted to add, so you're, yeah.
So I think the challenge when it comes to doing this level of organizing is that also understanding how to meet people where they're at, right? Especially within our communities. Our communities are very marginalized. That there's so much disinvestment. There's less education. There's language isolation. There's also people. Many of these communities. I think about McKinley Park. If you look at McKinley Park, there's a roughly numbers, 57% Latino population, and a growing 24% Asian population as well, with a 17% white, 2% black residents. Once you add those numbers, it really still is an immigrant community, right? At the same time, a lot of these folks are also living within the shadows of the system. So when these level of economic developments that come in and you analyze them, they become toxic developments to our communities. They also bring labor exploitation. So by the time our communities really try to muster any energy to organize, these folks are working long hours. They're also shying away, trying not to ruffle feathers with the system. At the same time, many of these community residents work for the very same industries that we're trying to hold accountable. Even if they are concerned about the environmental issues that we're trying to raise to their attention, the first thing that they will say, well, who's going to put food on the table and who's going to pay my bills? Right. So that continues to be a very challenging part of this work. But yes, I think I'll leave it at that.
No, that's fantastic. Really, really, really powerful stuff. Jose, we know that Little Village Environmental Justice Organization had a big victory getting the Crawford coal plant closed. But on that land now is another logistics facility to add to the many already existing in Little Village and surrounding area. You've already, as have others, made reference to the impacts of some of that truck traffic. Is there anything you want to add or any strategies you want to talk about that you're engaging in to address some of this?
Well, I want to build on some stuff that was said earlier too. I want to first talk about the structure of the industrial corridors and like why kind of going back to the zoning, the way that it's been used against us. I mentioned that some of these areas have been industrial since 1850s, right? But during the deindustrialization period, one of the things that happened was we saw so much job loss in Black and Latino communities, especially in Black communities, right? So one of the things that the late great Harold Washington did was he created this local industrial retention initiative, and the purpose of that was to retain industry in some of these communities on the south and west sides that had experienced massive job loss, and he created it, right. His purpose was, how do we rebuild this base, this critical part of our labor force that has sustained our community and provided pretty decent paying jobs for a long time. But then after his death, and the second mayor Daley actually took that to another level and officially created the Leary program and these industrial corridors in 1991, I believe it was. So these industrial corridors, with the 26 that we have in our city, are officially zoned as manufacturing, right? And that's because they're zoned like that, right? That's the reason why how the city uses that justification, like Alfredo said, right, to bypass the alderman a lot of times, or alderperson a lot of times, and then get the entire development approved by the Department of Planning and Development. So this is a really critical aspect of how environmental racism is perpetuated by the city. It's through the use of zoning, and that's the way that it's been throughout the history of the EJ movement, right? So they justify these developments through economic development, right? Say we're gonna bring these X amount of jobs to your community. Therefore, your community has to remain a sacrifice zone, right? So our communities continue to get sacrificed in the name of economic development. And what we've seen with, for example, with the Crawford and Fisk coal plants, right? This was as was mentioned, right? This was a 12 to 15-year fight, depending on who you're talking to get these two coal plants closed down, right? The one in Pilsen, like Rose mentioned, and then the one in Little Village. These are, especially and think about the Little Village one, right? This was a really critical location because it's right off the I-55 expressway, right? The Stevenson, this is the highway between Chicago and Joliet. This is actually one of the busiest freight corridors in the entire country. And of course, we've also in a battle right now around the I-55 expansion, which we won't get into right now. But all this stuff is related because the reason why they're wanting to expand it is to provide more access for trucks to come in and out of this region. And if you look at the I-55 corridor all along from Chicago to Joliet, there's warehouses all along I-55 in Bolingbrook, and it's growing a lot. So this stuff is all connected. And in Little Village, right, when this whole fight around replacing the Crawford coal plant, we had created this is before I was at the organization, but we had created a Crawford Reuse Task Force, right? We were working with former Mayor Rahm Emanuel, with our alderman at the time, Rick Munoz, and other organizations in the community to come up with a plan to reuse that or to figure out some kind of a way of redeveloping that site, right? This site that had been toxic for so many years, constructed in 1924, for 80 plus years, this site polluted the community, right? And people in the community actually used to call it the cloud factory, right? Because it would literally, just put out these clouds of coal pollution, excuse me, and so there was a lot of hope, right? When we closed this coal plant in 2012, we thought we could do something really good with this site. There was a lot of demand for food production, right? We in Little Village, right? It's predominantly Mexican immigrant communities. A lot of folks have experience with food production or some kind of agricultural experience in their backgrounds. So and then of course we have a huge food economy in the community. If anybody who's been in Little Village knows we have the best tacos in the whole city. You can't argue with that. I'm sorry. But we have a lot of street vendors, right? We have a lot of vendedores that are out there selling elotes, selling tamales, selling all these different things. So we have a huge food economy in the community, and so there was people wanted to see the reuse of Crawford and serving some of our kind of a food incubator, some kind of business incubator. There was stuff talking about a commercial kitchen, right? What kind of things we want to do with that. So we had a number of ideas around renewable energy and all these great things, green economy, and in a backroom deal, ultimately our former mayor sold this piece of property with the help of our former alderman. Sold this property to the developers, Hilco, who purchased it. Had plans to they completely scrapped any kind of ideas that we had for the site. They had plans to build a 1.3 million square foot distribution center, which is the largest warehouse within city limits. This was in 2018. So ultimately, we were in this 2-year fight to try to stop it from happening. But because of the zoning regulations, the way that because of how it was zoned as, right, the developers had the support of the city, they had the support of the developers. They were talking about all the jobs they were going to bring to the community. And ultimately, if folks remember, folks who are from Chicago probably saw what happened Easter weekend of 2020 when they went to demolish the smokestack and imploded it during the height of a respiratory pandemic, right, where people are dying left and right. They decided, and actually in the zip code that had the highest number of deaths during COVID as well, 60623, they decided to implode a 80-year-old smokestack without any kind of notification, any kind of notice for the city or for the community. I mean, and essentially, right, we had this huge cloud of smoke of toxic dust that engulfed the community. And thankfully, there was folks out there who were recording it. We had drone footage.
You had what is the name of the bottle? The old ocean spray bottle.
Yeah.
It was an actual drone.
It was an actual drone this time. So we did capture footage of it, and of course this was all over the news. It was all over every media site. And we're still in this fight right now around that site, mostly around job access and electrification. But of course, very few people have actually still been held responsible for that the debacle, including somebody who at the city Department of Public Health, Dave Graham, who actually was just promoted to oversee all environmental and regulations and oversight. I mean, it's crazy the amount of just continued disrespect that we see from departments that are supposed to be protecting our environment, protecting our communities, and saying actually this person who was clearly responsible, was even identified in the report by the Inspector General, the OIG's office, to actually say he should have been recommended for being fired. Not only reprimanded and fined, but fired, and now we're actually going to give him a promotion. So that's where we're at with a lot of our EJ work still.
Amy, go ahead and add to that.
Yeah, I want to add to what both Rose and and Jose are referencing about trust, right? We're talking about communities, how do we engage communities? Because the same challenges are happening in the labor movement, the same challenges are happening in restorative justice movements. How do we engage the public? How do we get young folks like yourselves involved and engaged in this high technology? Where the trust has been broken. And we were talking about earlier in the day when we were networking with one another about the generation. I say my generation versus your generations. I'm 44. I've been doing this work for over 30 years. And there was a time when the civil rights era, if you will, the labor era, suffered so much injustice that they didn't train us how to properly organize, right? They didn't train us the old-fashioned ways of turning people out and turning things. And sometimes we were just told, color inside the lines. You got a good job. You got organizations of color that learn a process or that get in a position or get in an alder person or a council person in the case of Joliet, and they stay there for years and years. And I call them the same old people elected, giving money to the same old nonprofit organizations, and the same stuff happens and the hood still looks the same 30 years later, right? And what are we doing to change that? And as one of the colleagues, I'm not sure which one, said, community groups in the driver's seat, like that's the change, right? Like when we're in co-governance and we're in the driver's seats and leading and we're setting our own plan, we're setting our own agenda for our respective communities, and we're saying and taking it to the elected leaders, do this or change. Not only do we want you involved and engaged in this EJ process and in these works and in these lanes, but we have to then become the decision makers. You all should be running for office. You all should be, and we should be supporting the trust amongst each other, just as fellow organizations. We see it all the time in the nonprofit industrial complex where we're competing for these dollars, but how are we becoming self-sustainable so we can direct our own path, so we can drive our own, right? And I think that is something that my generation and did not properly show your generation, but seeing the fire in your eyes and the work and the radical work that you guys are doing to stand up for the right to breathe, the right to have good, clean drinking water, right, has motivated our generation to say, we got to get off our hands. We literally were told, just do the right thing. You finally got you a good job. You do the right thing. You finally got into a position. And how many times does somebody that you know work to their bones? They literally, you can think of all the little organizations and little churches and stuff where they've given till they look exhausted, right? I've had it happen to me. Like, how are we making sure that we're healthy enough to do the work and our organizations are healthy enough to carry out the work? And our executive director, Marco, said this, quit saying it, but I'm like, if I get hit by a Mack truck tomorrow, who's going to continue the work? I'm always trying to cross-train and say, who's going to be the next program director in this work? Who's going to be the next Jose? Who's going to be the next Rose? If something happens and I win the lotto, and I'm not here tomorrow, I'll probably fund the work, right? But if I'm not here tomorrow, who's going to step into these shoes? And my responsibility is then, what framework have we left behind for you all not to have to reinvent the wheel? Because if you have to go and recreate the whole systems and learn the lessons all over again, what good is that doing to the movement and the greater good and the cause, right? Your children and then your grandchildren are then having bad drinking water in an aquifer that's going to dry out before they're even born. So what framework are we leaving behind? What trust are we building amongst each other to leave and build that trust that we were just talking about? Because it is time for you to step up. But as someone who's been doing this for a long time, I don't want to just sit on this panel. I want to say, what's your idea? Let me help you get involved. How can I plug in? What stories are you telling and what work do we need? And how are we, somebody said it earlier, like we're getting seats at the table. We need to become the table. Like, their tables don't serve us. We need to change, not just get a seat at the table only, because it has to start there, right? But we need to become the table, saying, this is our table, this is our lane, this is how we're going to fund it, and this is the work we're going to do. And they can just watch us as we pass by. They can watch from the curb, right?
You can't sit with us no more.
Yeah, you can't sit with us no more. I love that.
That was awesome.
Yeah, we
Thank
got
you.
to.
Can we just God, I feel like we should have planned like an action right after this.
I know, right? I think
Like, and then we're all gonna go.
I got signs in my car, don't play.
I know. I bet you do. I just wanted to say just a couple things about this connection to labor. I think that we are in this really interesting time because even like in my neighborhood, there was 5,000 auto workers that were on strike. And I could cry right now about like how emotional that was, like for 21 days. I am gonna cry. Fuck. that wasn't planned. But for 21 days, I was driving through my neighborhood and, beeping every time I went to go drop off my kids, bringing hot chocolate. One night it was super fucking cold and they were just all huddled by the fire. We went and got some White Castles. We sat with them, talked with them. And, to see, like, oh God, I am going to cry. This contract that Ford has secured is so fucking incredible. Like Sean Fain is a fucking hero. Like, I love the 11 a.m. Announcements that would come on, and my whole family would stop and like, we're looking and like, what is he saying? And then it was just so smart to negotiate the big three contracts all at the same time in this moment. But let me remind folks like how we got there. There was a caucus in the United Auto Workers that said, fuck the way things have been going. We're going to start our own caucus at UAWD, just like the teachers in the city of Chicago started the core caucus that said this leadership is in bed with these companies, and we're not seeing changes, and we're going to take it over. 140,000 auto workers, okay, they weren't all on strike at the same time, but that's what we were talking about, a labor force, right? Like making demands that we should be working 4 days a week. Making demands that a just transition demands that we're going to transition to electric vehicles in the future. That is our future, and maybe eliminating vehicles at some point too. But we have to start planning for that so electric workers can also be part of this union, and they fucking did that. They fucking did that. And then Chris Smalls organizing Amazon workers in New York. Hello, it is happening. Like workers, we don't have to tell them how bad it is. It is that bad. What our job is to connect them to all the people who are suffering. Auto workers, the teachers, all of us in our communities. This is the just transition. It is when, I don't think people understand how important it was for the UAW president to be talking about just transition. We have been wanting labor and environment to be working together for years, and we have been continually pitted against each other. We have been continually you can't have you can't have a clean neighborhood. You have to choose. You want jobs or you want a clean neighborhood. You can't have both. Fuck that narrative, okay? That is untrue. Like, we actually have proof that if you do a just transition, if you have a sustainable economy, it will create more jobs. It would jumpstart that vision of a sustainable community, like it's happened already, and we have to keep pushing for that. The alternative is bleak, and it doesn't serve us. And we have to get really clear on who our targets are. We have to name them by name and go after them. So Marty Ozinga from the Ozinga Company, we're coming after you, right? Like you are in our crosshairs. Like we are going to organize and make sure that companies like Ozinga, like Mad Asphalt, don't get away with what they're doing right now, which is murder. And the connections that we're seeing, we've been talking a lot about what's happening in Gaza. And the crisis, we're watching, like 10,000 people have been murdered already. Like, because we want to have our colonial, our country, our imperial country wants to have our, security in all of these areas and embassies and control over all of this whole planet. And they know that the planet is going to hell in a handbasket, and they're going to make as much fucking money as they can on the way there. They don't care who dies. They don't care who pays, because they know that they're going to be able to buy their island off of New Zealand, which they're literally already doing. Like, these folks are already doing this, like finding areas that have the most stable climate so that they can put roots there for them and their families in the future, while everybody else is literally on fire. Canada was on fire. We saw that. We saw that in Chicago, how disgusting that was. So I think it's extremely important, like if you don't leave with anything else, is to know that there is a role for all of us in this work. Like we absolutely have to dig in. We have to ask those tough questions. And yeah, it's hard, it's scary, but what is the alternative? And we need engineers, architects. I just said this on a panel on Sunday. Attorneys, 99% of attorneys who work in the environmental field work for the fucking industry to make sure that they could figure out how to work those environmental laws to benefit their industry. 99% of environmental lawyers work for industries. That is just, yeah, it's just awful. So yeah, we have our work cut out for us, but we are not mincing our words up here. I think everybody, you've heard from all these speakers, we know exactly who our targets are. That's why we.
It's not one another, right? It's not each other. It's not, our black, brown, and brown, like our low-income white folks. We are all in those industries and in those sacrifice zones
Yes.
together, breathing that same air, getting those same piss poor jobs, getting that same slight together. And I despise seeing it in media all the time where we're pitted against each other, like you
Totally.
mentioned, but it's not each other. We have got to stand up and stand together.
Absolutely.
Well, very powerful. So I have one last question before I turn it over to Professor Haverlock, and it's very much related to this concept of we that you all keep referring to, right? There's a very much of a sense that you are connected to one another and that you're connected to a movement. And Jose, an important characteristic of the environmental justice movement since its early days and since the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991 is the formation of networks. You represent Alvejo on the National Moving Forward Network, and here in Chicago, you have all created the Chicago EJ Network. Can you tell us about some of the work in these networks, and address what is possible because of the coming together of environmental justice groups in these networks?
Definitely want to start with, right, we have 3 members of the Chicago EJ Network here, us, SETF, and Neighbors for EJ, and what we've done in the Chicago area, I think, has been nothing short but amazing, right? I mean, we've collaborated and accomplished so much. I mean, the cumulative impacts ordinance that they were talking about is a product of that. And there's other networks, right? There's the Midwest EJ Network, there's the Climate Justice Alliance, there's the Just Transition Alliance that's really within the CJA, and the Moving Forward Network, which we heavily are heavily involved with. It's a network of over 50 organizations in 20 different cities who are all working on zero emission freight. And I think this is really, really critical for the future of not only the Chicago area but the entire country, right? Because transportation is becoming one of the leading sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Here in the Chicago area and in the state of Illinois, transportation is our biggest source of pollution, right? I mentioned earlier the I-55 corridor, but we also, Chicago is already one of the dirtiest, actually third worst in terms of total air pollution in the country, and that was even before the fires from Canada. So it's always, it's going to continue to get worse, and it's because we have the most amount of freight infrastructure in the country. So electrification of medium and heavy duty vehicles is really critical. That being said, the conversation around electrification has to be much more holistic in general, right? Because we know that there's issues with mining in the global south, right? We know, in terms of geopolitical, neo-colonial issues of continuing these, the systems of extraction and of lithium, or just extraction of resources in one part of the global south and then consumption in the global north, right? We know that lithium and cobalt and these things are creating mining issues, labor issues that are really happening at the expense of the local population, so that we can get electric vehicles in the U.S. or in the global north, right? So I think the conversation around that, number one, is still something that we need to continue to have, so that we can put pressure on on national governments, but also just kind of our global leaders around making sure that we're not perpetuating the same systems of domination and imperialism that we've have experienced over the last 500 years, right? That's a key thing. But then also the conversation, right? The thing that Olga just brought up, right, is a lot of mobility justice folks are not completely on board with electrification because they're concerned that it's just going to be more incentives for people to continue driving, right? When we're trying to invest in public transit, invest in bicycle infrastructure, invest in complete streets, and making sure that communities are walkable, right? But we're incentivizing more people to drive by just getting everybody just to drive an electric vehicle, and it's gonna be all right because there's no more pollution, right? So it's not that simple. And then the same thing with trucks, right? Is we're concerned that that if we have more electric vehicles, or we have all electric vehicles, and that's just gonna be more incentives for warehouses or for the logistics companies to electrify their fleets and then expand their footprint, right? And it's like, well, what are you complaining about? There's no more diesel pollution. Yeah, but electric trucks are still very dangerous to our communities, right? So, right, they're faster, they're quieter, so you don't even hear them coming sometimes, right? They accelerate much quicker than a diesel truck. So this can't be just an excuse to let just let's run wild with warehouses and I mean, we understand it's a critical part of our economy, right? 1 in 4 jobs in the Chicago area is in some way related to the movement of goods, whether it's working directly as a truck driver, working at the rail yards, working at the warehouses. This is a critical part of our economy. So we understand when we're talking about just transition, right? We're talking about electrification and some of these things. There's going to be a lot of potential job loss that we need to be thinking about, but also then how do we replace that is really critical, and that's what folks like Moving Forward Network are working on, is that zero emission freight part of it. So from the electric vehicle production to some of the vehicle maintenance to the building of the charging infrastructure itself, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for job loss. Not to mention, right, there's been a number of reports that have come out from the Respiratory Health Association, from NRDC, from Union Concerned Scientists around just the amount of money that we're spending collectively on healthcare related to pollution, right? So you talk about the money that's saved because people don't have to go to the ER anymore, don't have asthma attacks, don't have premature death issues, just all the concerns around healthcare. Where we're talking about billions that are saved every year collectively. So there's still some other things that can't fully be measured in terms of jobs that are going to be critical to our economy. So I think those are some of the things that we're continuing to work on. And the last thing I'll say is, right, this is really critical because the Clean Air Task Force, every year they produce estimates for the upcoming year about the impacts of diesel pollution or of air pollution in general. And I think in 2023, at the beginning of 2023, they anticipated that there would be 416 premature deaths. I think it was like 5,000 asthma attacks. It was like 2,000 heart attacks, something like that. So there's a bunch of predictions that are related to air pollution. We talk about 416 people, right? Like you mentioned, right? These aren't just numbers. These are people. These are names, right? So I mean, I love that quote because that's really so important, right? We don't talk enough about air pollution as a public health crisis, and we need to, right? This is literally our livelihoods, right? All that stuff we're inhaling has impacts on our respiratory, on our cardiovascular system down the road, on young people, on elderly folks. So the work that we're all doing, these national networks, these international networks of folks, is really critical to the future of our planet.
Yeah, all right. So, momentary stretch break. I'm going to pass now the baton to Professor Haverlock. I mentioned when I started that this was part of a project that's called Crossing Latinidades. And part of what we want to bring out is also the cultural aspects of some of this work. So we're going to shift gear a little bit now and talk about what are some of the cultural aspects of your organizing and of the work that you're doing. So with that, Professor?
All right, thank you. Thanks so much. All right, everyone. It's already been, dare I say, an electrifying panel. And I know that probably everyone in the room is absorbing these things and ready to take action, and I want to make sure that we have time to hear from all of you to outline that. But what I think I might do, because we only have a half an hour left, is maybe I'll tell you the questions, and so you can wrap these things around in what you want to say, and we make sure that everything is said And we also leave some time for everyone in the room to connect with you one-on-one so that, we do real tactics and real action. So the first thing that I want to bring up, exactly as my colleague said, are the cultural aspects of this, right? The panel is Latino Environmental Justice Leadership along Industrial Waterways. And we've heard quite a bit about the industries and the structures that you're up against. So what I want to ask is, what are you drawing from, right? This work, as you've talked about, it requires a lot of different talents, a lot of energy, a lot of personal sacrifice. So, what do you draw from in cultural terms, right? From your background, from Latino cultures, from Chicago, Chicano, Mexicano cultures. And along with that, I want to ask a little bit of how are you driven by your connection to place, right? Whether that's the neighborhood, the place that you live, a site that you love, like those sacred places. And let's not forget the water in all of this, because as you've outlined, these are industrial waterways. They have different water quality thresholds, right? It's called waterways because they're not always treated as rivers. But I want to bring up like that, your own relationship to place, to the air, the earth, the forest, the water, and and how do you draw from that? So the other questions that we'll put in there, just to give you all more time, is, of course, we're here at UIC at the university. Your advice for people who want to engage this work in the short and the long term. So, what would you say to people, whatever their age, about getting involved? And finally, where we want to go is we want to go out with your visions. We've talked a lot about oppressive structures and history that keeps repeating itself. But how do you see your work transforming history? And what kind of visions do you have for the future? And what kind of solutions are you pushing for in the day-to-day? So those are the questions. I bet by the time everyone answers it, we'll go out. So weave it as you will, and then we'll start with Olga and go down the line.
I think I want to just start a little bit about a lot of the EJ organizations across the country are led by women of color, and I think it's really important to reflect on why that is. And in the southeast side of Chicago, because it was a steel mill town, like the men went to work in the steel mill, and actually was on a tour with somebody who was giving a tour about my neighborhood, and it was when I first got involved, and they said, so we know what the men were doing. We know they were organizing in their unions. We know, that this was happening, but what were the women doing? And the tour guide was like, well, they were at home, like, baking and, like, barefoot and pregnant. I was outraged. I was like, well, first of all, like, women are the caretakers. They're taking care of the household. They're managing budgets. They're accountants. They're nurses. They held the community up. So that the men could go to work, right? Like that's a really important part. And women are also we're not socialized to talk about money. We're not socialized to talk about like what does it cost. Like there's this expectation if you're a woman in the especially Latina and Black women in the movement. That we should be doing this like because we're like these benevolent creatures that are just like here to take care of everybody. No, that's not it. I started taking, been in charge of this organization. It used to be one part-time employee. We have 10 full-time people on staff right now. All of them are from the neighborhood, single moms. And having to like wheel and deal in the nonprofit industrial complex, is not easy because one, it is very hard to like talk about the things that have and the challenges that we have overcome because we're not socialized to do that. So I think part or like they say bonitas y calladitas, in Spanish, like just you look cute and pretty but quiet. You know, like that's the expectation of women. And so like women who have been able to pave the way, I think comes from like seeing how hard our mothers and our grandmothers struggled, and to say we want a different life for the next generation of Latina women and Black women, and through this experiment of fighting for environmental justice, we're trying to push that forward. So I just wanted to focus a little bit about like the women in my family that have inspired me. My grandmother, Eulalia Ramirez, who's from Totatiche, they're actually La Boquilla. He's from a rancho in Jalisco, and you know she had 10 children. And my grandfather left to work. You know, he was part of the Bracero program, but he didn't come back and abandoned my grandmother and her 10 children. And my grandmother actually came to South Chicago to work, and she worked at a restaurant. She actually packed my dad's lunch on the way to the steel mill, and then later she left back to take care of some of the little children who were having a hard time, were not surviving. She had to go back to Mexico and sent my mom and my aunt. My mom was 15 when she came, and my aunt was 16. And they came and they were housekeepers in Northbrook, Illinois, and then in the weekends they would come and be in the south side of Chicago where their other sister was. They went to church, and that's where they met my dad. But my dad was like to my mom, "You look very familiar." And it was discovered after several dates that it was her mom, my grandmother, who was packing my dad's lunch in the neighborhood restaurant. But there's just so many stories like that, and trying to overcome poverty in your country, coming to the United States to work in these steel mills, and then just like the way that things have played out. You know, one of the reasons that people don't talk about when the steel, does anybody here have an idea of like why the steel mills closed across the Great Lakes? Like, any suggestions, anything that comes to mind? I see some. Should I just call on somebody since I'm at UIC?
You're in that seat. It is within your.
Well, I'm gonna say Teresa. What do you think? I see you nodding. I want to call on the professor.
Oh, sure, all right, well, because the companies went and looked for cheap labor and profits and something.
That is
else.
true. It's also true that the United States bombed the absolute crap out of Japan and Germany, and they had a chance to rebuild steel mills using more advanced technology that required less workers and were actually cleaner than the steel mills that were here. So the world was now getting steel from Japan. The Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
And so it is like all of these things, like we have like very patriotic community, and the same folks, who are like, very patriotic in my community, but also are not are making those connections, that this is one of those things, that comes from war, that this is like these impacts that we have on our community. So I just wanted to share a little bit about, how a little deeper about my grandmother and like the culture of like women survivors and fighting so hard. So like we have a very important story. So in the future, if anybody goes to our community for a tour, I will make sure to really focus on the role that women had, because without us, we wouldn't be able to have what we have now in our community, and including, so many women leaders. So I'm like the third woman leader of my organization, and then when I think about all the organizations just like 7 minutes away from my office, Hazel Johnson and her daughter Cheryl Johnson, who continue working in Elk Elk Gardens, and then Kim Wasserman and Little Village, and Alfredo and your partner Mirna, working in McKinley Park. There's just like this legacy of women who had to get really smart about dollars and how they're going to fund the movement, and go after those dollars and go after those those big greens that were both guarding all this money and then breaking down doors for us so that we are able to now have organizations where we can offer careers. Like we're offering careers at CDIF for people from the neighborhood. It's full benefits, insurance, and starting on December 1st, 401k, for the staff.
Thank you, Olga. Alfredo?
Let me see if I can make my response coherent just on those multiple, questions. But I think that I would like to start with, providing the advice here to the space. I think it's very important to understand that this work is very complicated, very complex, right? One of the things going back to the way that neighbors formulated, I remember we had, key folks, right, that became the core of the organization. We had an attorney, we had people that were doing, researchers, we had people that had understanding of, federal and state, sort of like environmental processes. And then we also had, community organizing, right? These were very key components as to how we came together. At the same time, anybody can provide a level of skill set or any level of talent. But if that skill set and that talent comes in, sort of hollow, it becomes problematic and detrimental to the work that we're trying to accomplish here. And what I'm trying to say is that you're going to have the option, right? You're going to carry an academic background. And it's going to be ultimately up to you. What are you going to do with that? Are you going to align yourself and use your skill set to continue to uplift the status quo? Or are you going to use your skill set and your talents and your knowledge to uplift these vulnerable communities? And I think that that's something that, Neighbors continues to demonstrate in the last 5 years. The level of integrity that we have done, it's amazing. It's challenging work, but it's very rewarding when you do that. I think that integrity and the level of credibility, people start to pay attention to you. People start to want to be part of your space. And we have received so many small and big contributions, and guess what? I embrace that to the fullest. I respect that. I respect people's time, efforts. I respect what they bring to the table. Neighbors has about 3 layers of the way that we're sustaining our work. We have our board of directors, which are very active. We have a growing staff. Now we are 3 in our staff, very young. And then we also have advisory members, depending on their interests, depending on their own intentions, and the ways that they want to sort of like come in and continue to uplift this work. Culturally speaking, I think for me, my motivation is knowing that this great city was built on immigrant hand. That's my motivation right there. My motivation is to continue to uplift the voices of these communities. And I really want to also applaud and recognize that I'm not trying to be divisive, right? It's really about uplifting the people that have been taking the brunt of environmental racism. But it's also very important to understand that there is also some white allyship that has been very key to this too. Absolutely. And that has to be sort of, called out on itself, whether they're being problematic, you address it, you confront that issue. But also the folks that have recognized their privilege to make sure that they're protecting the overall environmental work has been very significant to our success as well. And I think that another piece here that I would like to just like quickly speak about is just transition, but also just culture. Right now, for me, I might be doing a disservice to myself. I'm actually putting almost 80 hours a week, which is not sustainable. So I'm going to hold you to your, if you win the lotto, yes. But at the same time, I think for me, it's also very important not just to identify positions of the organization, but to make sure that we put together onboarding processes to make sure these positions are successful. We need mentorship. We need, to walk away from the 40-hour week, right? Where right now neighbors actually, at a very young age, a very young, organization, I'm already providing every other Friday off. And I'm also providing, beyond their PTO hours, I'm providing 3 weeks of health and wellness. I don't have, once again, the capacity to do that, but I do care about the people that I'm bringing to the table. I do care about the people that are working with me. I know it has been growing pains. I'm not perfect. At the same time, I am willing to learn how to work with others, and to also make sure that I'm listening. I'm not just here delegating. I'm here listening, and I'm also here to make sure that we work as a team, and that we work to, once again, uplift these communities that have been heavily impacted.
Thank you, Alfredo.
Pilsen is predominantly Hispanic. It's about 70%. And because of gentrification, it is slowly moving. Because of the higher rents, a lot of individuals that have lived there for many, many decades are forced to leave because they cannot afford it any longer. And that's the reality of what's happening in Pilsen. And culturally, I can say that as I relate to my ancestors, I find it very foreign to live in this society where we throw everything away and where capitalism is the name of the game. More is not better, less is more, where the quality of our lives are enhanced, not with more material things. I think at this point, we're overburdened with things where someone gives you something and that's the reality. You just like, oh, you don't really need it. Why do I need another Christmas gift? Why do I need another pair of pants? Why do I need it's like, to me, it burdens me. I don't even go shopping only because I have enough. I don't like to have more things than what I already have. Like I said, ancestrally, it's foreign to the way my ancestors lived. They lived and respected the land. We were one with the land. We were not going against and polluting and getting as much as we could off of the land. That's so contrary to the way my ancestors, and I say that because I remember that advertisement with that Indian who has a teardrop falling from his cheek when he sees those American kids throwing their garbage out of that vehicle that they're driving. And that pierces his heart to see what is happening to his land. These American spoiled kids who don't really know what they're doing. It's just the way that they have been brought up and the way that we all have been trained in this capitalistic society. So it's not really these American kids, they might not really understand, but it's still heartbreaking how that Indian knows, he knows with knowledge of where he came from, that's not the way. And that does bring a teardrop when I see that, because I know that we all come from this land, and for us to go against it, it's going against our own selves at the same time. So with that, I would say also that Peril is not very large. It's few, I would say, volunteers, and money does keep things going, of course. So we're looking for more grants in order to expand. So that's, of course, the future is grants.
Amy?
Thank you. I'm not gonna lie, it was a little overwhelming when I saw the list of panelists. I was really intimidated because I'm like, these are EJ like legends and doing the work for real. And I'm just a girl from the east side of Joliet. And I felt very shrunken and small, and thank goodness we had the prep meeting because they empowered me and made me feel inspired. But I come from, like I said, I come from the east side of Joliet, and for me, our story is a little different. I shared my story of survival, right? I'm not a victim of gun violence, I'm a survivor, and I believe that that has a purpose. And I believe every day we walk in our purpose and our calling to inspire and empower others. Culturally, I watched my community do a great flight, and they call it the white flight, westward. It was the river that divided us that kept expanding further west, because in our neighborhoods, you really made it if you bought a house on the west side. But during the time that they were drowning in riverboat revenue, they kept expanding westward, but they never once even repaired the water infrastructure on the historic east side. And now we refer to it as a legacy community. These are residential neighborhoods that I grew up in, and people like my good friend and former karate classmate, Denny Reyes. His legacy and memory lives with me forever. He was shot and killed immediately with a gun that was so powerful it would have went straight through a bulletproof vest. He was shot a half a block away from the Spanish Community Center, where we still serve and work with and partner with today. His murder was more impactful to me as a young child than even surviving my own shooting was. So I serve and I volunteer for folks like him and others that fell victim to gun violence. Also, the cultural aspect of what I call the PC era, the post-crack era. When I talk about we're connected from Chicago to Joliet, when the older Chicago folks tell me if they didn't see their friend or relative for a long time, they're like, "Where you been, Joliet?" Thinking that they went to the old Joliet Correctional Center for a while to serve prison time. Now we're connected by this pipeline that's being built from Chicago to Joliet. So for me, the culture is telling the history so we don't repeat itself, for being what I like to refer to in a biblical sense, a nail in a sure place, making sure that those that come behind me know where we've been so we don't go to those places hopefully anymore. They tell us that it takes 3 generations to erase a culture, erase a history, erase a language from a people. So I think it's important to tell our lived experiences. I think we're more alike than we are different. So my challenge is, if I could quote the late, great Tupac Amaru Shakur, and say, I'm not saying I will change the world, but I guarantee you I will spark the brain that does. And I want to keep telling our rich historic history, our threats, our risks, and our hopefully successful outcomes, and those things, so we can do that. I was able to sit, and I forget her name, and my phone fell, and I didn't want to reach behind me to get it, but she was Medgar Evers' secretary during the Civil Rights Movement. And she gave a wonderful speech during an ecumenical service on MLK Day, and my good friend and colleague was receiving an award that night. And afterwards, when she was doing the meet and greet, in the most powerful, aggressive, Southern Baptist type of way, she grabbed my hands and she looked into my eyes and she said, "Sister, we have got to stay in this struggle together. We are more alike than we are different." And so I challenge all of you today to stay in this fight, to do the work, to keep learning all the things, and get involved. Start somewhere and figure it out on the way. You just need to take the first step. And lastly, on behalf of Warehouse Workers for Justice, I would like to uplift and advocate the campaigns that we are going to be launching for workers' rights and protections, especially I was first involved with Warehouse Workers for Justice in 2012 when I sat on a panel, and I was not a warehouse worker. I didn't feel like their fight was my fight. And they're like, "Just sit on the panel, Amy, just listen to these stories." And I listened to the stories of women not just getting the wage inequality and the access to promotions, but I was able to listen to their stories of sexual harassment in the workplace, about a sexual assault that occurred for a 19-year-old young girl whose mother and her mother's boyfriend also worked there, and being threatened, "If you report, I will call ICE on your parents," and all of the stories. We are still very much dealing with women on the front lines and sexual harassment and sexual violence, even domestic violence happening in the workplace. And that is in a campaign and an initiative that cannot go without all of you all with us and supporting us. So I just wanted to uplift the Women's Committee. We are always taking volunteers and supporters, allies, and advocates. So please visit us at www.4j.org about ways to get involved and get plugged in. And solidarity forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
So thank you for this question. I don't know if y'all can tell, but I'm kind of a historian. History is a big part of the work that I do, and I'm also a data guy. So I think in getting my degrees in urban planning and now going for my PhD in geography and GIS, one of the things that I've always thought about is what is my role in the EJ movement? What is my role in social justice work as a whole, right? And so I think that's, in terms of like just giving, kind of similar to what Alfredo said about giving you all advice, like, there's a lot of roles within these organizations aside from just organizing, right? Organizing is where it all starts, right? That's where we, it's the base of everything. We have to have a base in order to be able to even do a lot of this work and do the popular education work and get community understanding what the issues are. But there's also expanding roles, right? We do policy work, right? We do a lot of policy advocacy work. We do, we're going down to Springfield sometimes and doing lobbyist work, right? Where we have to go and talk to these lawmakers about actually changing some of these things that are in place. There's people, now on staff at Alvejo, we have, I think, maybe 5 or 6 people who have their MUPs or who are getting their MUP degree, right? So I mean, that right there, the fact that we've expanded so much, we've grown so much. I mean, we've I think probably doubled since COVID started, which is crazy to think about. But I think are like over 26, 27 now on staff. Most of them are full time. We do provide a lot of nice benefits. So I think it's really nice to be able to have those degrees and work at an organization like El Vejo, where not only am I doing great work, but they're able to pay me and pay my colleagues what we're worth, right? And I think that makes it something that where folks like you all who are getting your degrees can have that opportunity to go work at an organization like one of ours, and like you said, right, have a career, not just have a job, but actually have a career that you're building, and then you're going to be able to help contribute to the movement in a number of different ways. So I think that's really critical, right? For me, starting when I came back to Chicago, and starting to really learn about the history of Latinos and in particular, right, Mexicanos is what I was more focused on. The history of our communities in Chicago, it's always, and just like many immigrant communities and migrant communities from the South, it was always tied to labor, right? Like we came here, literally the first 3 waves of Mexican migration what happened in 1916, 1919, and 1921. 1916 was a wave that came working in the railroad or the rail yards right here in this area, the near west side. 1919 was the steel, and 1921 was the meat packing and back of the yards, right? And these first 3 waves of migration created patterns of migration that would last until present day. And one of the things that I was able to do when I was a master's student was in my second year of the master's program, I produced a report called the Latino Neighborhoods Report, where we looked at the top 12 neighborhoods in the city. And actually, I was working for the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy downstairs, and we collaborated with GCI on this report. And we're also going to be updating the report in the very near future, so keep an eye out for that. And then for my master's thesis, I did looking at the history and the incorporation of Latino workers into the Chicago economy, right? The way that we've been segmented and segregated even into certain low-paying, low-wage industries, which continues to persist until today, right? And I looked, going back, there was an article that I updated that went from the early days to 1980s, and I updated that from 1980 to present day to see what the changes were. And we continue to be segmented in the lowest paying occupations and industries. And the biggest part of that is around a heavy industry and the service industry, right? So when we have such a critical part of our labor force, involved in the lowest paying occupations and industries, what does that mean then for everything else, right? For our communities, our incomes, our educational attainment, all these different things. So, so for me, that's why, like I said, I say all that to say, I saw my role in this movement as being somebody who can contribute that data, can contribute those that history and the understanding of how we even got here. And I know, like Alfredo mentioned, right, we collaborate a lot on data stuff. One of the biggest issues that we've seen locally is our lack of data, of accessible data, right? We had to go out there and do air monitoring ourselves. We had to go out there and do truck counting ourselves because nobody provided that for us, right? We know that there's some data that comes from, like, in terms of transportation, like that comes from IDOT, right, Illinois DOT. And even by their own acknowledgement, there's some highways that have over 30,000 trucks a day coming through them. So you think about 30,000 just in one day times 365, we're talking about over 10 million truck trips happening just on one highway alone, right? So this is data, in terms of that's some data that we get, but then we were like, what does that look like locally, right? So that's why he mentioned the truck data that we did at Western and Pershing. We're actually currently right now working on a truck counts report where we did, I think, 38 intersections across the city, mostly the south and southeast, southwest sides. And just, we working with this company where they set up these cameras for 24 hours and we collect all this footage. And then, they use this technology to break it down and all that, go into too much detail, but I just want to make sure y'all know what's coming up. But we actually have these numbers now, right? Before, when we were presenting some of these numbers and some of this data to the city, they were able to dismiss us and be like, oh, you guys cooked up those numbers, or that's not really what it is. Well, now we got the video footage to prove it. Like, there's nothing you can say about that. We have the evidence. We know that there's some intersections that we're seeing, over 5,000, 5,500 diesel-powered vehicles passing through that intersection in one 24-hour period. So when you do the math, again, we're talking about millions of truck trips happening across the Chicago region every year. So again, just in thinking about what your role could be in this movement, and what does it look like for me, is being able to provide this data, or help provide this data, help collect this stuff, help put things into context so that we can advance the policy, because that's a lot of times where the actual change happens on the policy level, right? So all these things are connected, from the organizing to the policy, right? How do we educate community, but also how do we educate politicians and policymakers, because ultimately they have the control of these things. So I think for you all is think about what is the role that you want to have, not just in EJ, but in general, in changing this world, right? We all know that capitalism is killing our world. So what does change look like? I know we're gonna talk about our visions right now if we have time, but I think about what your role is in helping, formulate that change.
All right, thank you so much, Jose. And, time is sometimes as difficult as space. We are in the visionary time, but our panel has come to a close. So let me propose this. Before we thank not only our environmental justice leaders, but our environmental justice visionaries and freedom fighters and scholars and data collectors, and really advocates for all of us to breathe, live, and drink water on this earth. My gratitude is pretty boundless. But what I'd like to ask everyone to do after we give a big round of applause and show our support and thanks, gratitude, enthusiasm for the panelists, after we do that, I'd like everyone to turn and introduce themselves to someone in their row or behind them that they did not come with, that they do not know. So let's, as Rose told us, let's break that ice and let's start to meet each other and percolate some ideas. So, someone you came with doesn't count. You have to talk to someone new. I'm making you do it. But before you do it, please join me in a very robust and wholehearted thank you to today's panelists.